Hey everybody, welcome to week 2, American government. You made it through the first week. Now let's just do this 14 more times. One thing I want to say before we start, as you've seen a little bit of an introduction as to how this course operates, you got a light workload week 1, just focusing on the discussions. Remember, in the future, we're going to be expecting to have a quiz or an assignment every week with 1 or 2 grace periods throughout the semester. So this week we have our first assignment. It is the easiest assignment you will have to do this whole semester. All you have to do is select your essay topic. So if you have any questions with that, please reach out to me. I'll respond relatively quickly. But you're just going to review the document, which I gave you a couple of essay topics to choose from. You select one, and that is what you're going to write your midterm and final paper on. Now, you can choose a topic that you prefer of your own desire. Now, if you do this, you have to, 1, give me a detailed breakdown of what your topic is. 2, tell me why it needs to be written about. What are you contributing to political science at large? And 3, how are you going to write about it? What topics are you going to pull from? And what are you going to aim to address in your paper? So a lot of what these papers are, they're written in ways that I want you to be able to analyze data, analyze both sides of an argument, or analyze one entire environment and circumstance. We'll talk a little bit more throughout the semester on how to do this, but this week, just think about what you find interesting in government, what you find interesting in this course, and identify that. We can change later on once you learn more about the content through these lectures, but once we get to week 8, we're pretty solidified in our essay topic, and what we're doing this week is just getting a starting foundation for what we will lean into if we don't, have anything that sparks our interest later on. So reach out if you have any questions about that. That is on eOnline, accessible through the modules tab. Please check that out. Should be right under this week's lecture. All right, let's get going. Let's start this lecture. So as I talked about last week, and you're going to see it this week too, we're getting an introduction to what the structures of these lectures are going to look like. The first thing we're going to do every week, when relevant, is we're going to cover what we learned in the last week, just to give you the opportunity to hear the content twice. So what did we learn last week? We learned that the United States is a representative democracy, referred to as a republic by our founding fathers, particularly James Madison. In his writings, we identified a concrete definition of both of these terms. And we see that they're basically interchangeable. Republic is a government with a scheme of representation. That is also referred in contemporary language as a representative democracy. We elect individuals to represent our primary interests. This system of government originates through compromise and the coexistence of diverse political approaches in a pluralist system of government. That second sentence is what we're going to dive into detail here today. So when we talk about government, we also talked about how the United States has gone through 2 periods, 2 significant systems of government, a confederal and currently what we have, a federal system. And we also have to understand one additional system of government, which we did not successfully implement in the United States, although we'll talk later on about how Alexander Hamilton did have his hopes for a unitary system. And to simply cover these, unitary system is a system of government in which power is concentrated in a central authority. Think of power being concentrated exclusively in DC. Now, a confederal system is one in which you have a breakdown of this power. Power is distributed amongst many, many small entities. Think of power being distributed to local and state governments here in Kalispell in Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, whatever it is. I just listed some southern states, New York and Cali too. So that is a system of confederal governance in which they have powers concentrated in all of those entities, and they influence the central entity. And then we have a federal system of government in which there is equal distribution of power between national and state governments, which is what we have today. Although there are times, environments, and circumstances where one entity has more authority over another, we do see a generally equal distribution of power between the two. We also remember that when we had the Articles of Confederation, in which we had a confederal system of government, Shays' Rebellion was a farmers' rebellion in Massachusetts, in which a handful of individuals lost their lives, but we saw that this revealed the detriments of our weak federal government under the Articles of Confederation, which inspired the downstream effect of the Shays' Rebellion is that it inspired the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which we will talk about in detail in today's lecture. So forgive me, I got a little bit of a cold, so I might be sounding a little sick, but we're going to do this. Let's go. So learning objectives, we're going to talk about some of our founding fathers, particularly John Adams and Samuel Adams. I do this because when I was a teaching assistant at UM, one of the professors who taught there had a heavy focus on the influence of these two individuals. And I think it's beneficial to make sure that above all, we know the difference between these very contrasting relatives. We also want to interpret the impact of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which I briefly mentioned a moment ago. And particularly, there were two compromises made at this convention that we're going to look at in detail. One great, literally referred to as the Great Compromise, and another not so great, but it is not referred to as the not so great compromise. We learned about it in high school history class as the Three-Fifths Compromise. But without these compromises, the existence of a federal system of government in the United States is not likely. So we look at two different versions of the Bill of Rights to identify the importance of compromise that was fostered by our founding fathers, the original draft provided by James Madison, and the concluded draft compromised by among all founding fathers. We also look at we're going to start to examine the division between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, collectives in early America that advocated on two different sides of a general debate. And then we're going to identify the importance of the text they use to convey their interest, while also concluding with a summary of what system we have, a pluralist system in the United States. And we'll get a concrete definition of pluralism. So a lot of what we're talking about today is the transition from the Articles of Confederation, the first system of government implemented in the United States, to the Constitution of the United States. And we look at some important aspects of this transition, including Shays' Rebellion, which we covered last week, in which a Massachusetts farmers' rebellion revealed the weaknesses of the federal government to both pass legislation effectively and quickly and mobilize military. So we also see the lack of support for the Constitution within this time period. We have a divide. Our founding fathers did not adamantly agree that there is one system we are implementing after this revolution. And instead, we have a great division, great debate, and eventually a great compromise between multiple systems of government. We also see there is a period of debates and writings in support and against the Constitution, in which we see this divide occurring in our public papers between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Bill of Rights we see as a compromise, loosely understood as a compromise between these two collectives, as the Bill of Rights originally restricts our federal government and provides protections for our state governments, interest advocated for by the Anti-Federalists, as they thought our federal government was far too strong under the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1788, and the Bill of Rights later ratified in 1791. All details we will dive into in later slides. So let's begin. Well, let's talk for a second about our founding fathers. We have an individual by the name of Samuel Adams. You may have know him as the father of the Revolution, the individual who mobilized many Americans to dump tea into the Boston Harbor at a time where they dressed as Native Americans and dumped this tea as a protest against the Tea Act of 1773, in which we had mass increases in taxes on many domestic goods. We also see that Samuel Adams aligned later on with the Anti-Federalists and was the second cousin to John Adams. Samuel Adams had a significant role to play in the Revolutionary period in early America. That's why he's known as the father of the Revolution, and I give you this simplified nickname, Revolutionary Samuel Adams, to help you remember the role he played, in contrast to his second cousin John Adams, who had a much more, a significantly different role in American history, which we'll dive into right now. The main conclusion from this slide is to remember what you learned in high school history. Samuel Adams, Revolutionary Samuel Adams, was the father of the Revolution who helped mobilize Americans to throw tea into the Boston Harbor, representing the revolutionary sentiments among the general population, aligning with the Anti-Federalists. And now we get to judicial John Adams. I gave you that important keyword right there, judicial. It helps summarize the impact he had on early American history and why we have a system of government that has so many protections for the judicial process. So first off, we remember the Boston Massacre, a point of history that I will not go over in detail, as you probably remember this from high school history. And in this moment, we had British troops contribute to the death of numerous settlers at the time, and this resulted in mass outcry of support for things like hanging these British soldiers, for intense reactions to this problematic moment in American history. John Adams stepped in and showed temperance, as this individual represented the British soldiers in our court system, advocated for equal representation for all individuals within the United States within the courts. Now, he later aligned with the views of the Federalists. He was the vice president under George Washington and eventually the second president of the United States. We will go into next week the period in which factions and political division became a talking point in American history. And we see the role John Adams played with his temperance, once again being able to give the office to Thomas Jefferson after he left and ended his second term as president, his first term as president. We'll go into detail on John Adams without confusing you. We'll wait for a later date. Today, the primary conclusion is that John Adams represented the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre and advocated for fair and equal treatment within our courts. Now, we remember we had that constitutional convention. Why do we have it? Well, Shays' Rebellion revealed the weaknesses of our federal government and revealed that we need to strengthen this system. We need to have a second attempt. Confederalism is not working. Instead, we must implement federalism. So the Constitutional Convention of 1787 brought all of our founding fathers together to the best of their abilities. They met to alter the Articles of Confederation in order to create a stronger central government that could respond to threats like Shays' Rebellion. And in this convention, we saw the implementation of the Great Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise. This is also where we're going to focus on the debate. This is also where the debate we're focusing on today sparked. The debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists regarding the ratification of the Constitution. Again, we were divided on whether we should implement what we today know as the Constitution of the United States. Federalists wanted it, and the Anti-Federalists did not want the ratification, citing that it was going to create a too strong and too centralized system of government. Now, the rest of this lecture will cover what occurred at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the preceding events. So, there were two approaches to the legislature when we were debating the Constitution. And of course, when we talk about government, you cannot implement a government without determining how this government will write laws. That is the primary objective of our legislature. We're going to dive into that on week 6 when we talk about the details of our legislature, how it operates, and how it came to be. Well, primarily right now we're talking about how it came to be. We had two proposals that were brought to the floor at the Constitutional Convention. I love this because it's the Virginia plan where I'm from and the New Jersey plan where my family's from. So we see that the Virginia plan was written by James Madison. Who wrote these plans, you do not have to remember, and we don't really need to remember the details of each plan as much as we need to remember that there were two contrasting approaches to the legislature that eventually resulted in a compromise between these two approaches. Neither one won out, but they both had aspects of their proposal implemented to our legislature. So the Virginia plan, written by James Madison, he wanted two bodies within the legislative branch, and he wanted these bodies to have representation based on population of each state. And that means we would have something that looks like a House of Representatives and a Senate, both with populations based on how many people lived in each state. So Virginia at the time would have a large amount of representation because they had a significant population, while New Jersey had a small population and would result in minimal representation. So of course, the representatives from small states like New Jersey were not fond of this proposal. So this would give disproportionate power to states with more people. The Virginia plan additionally proposed 3 branches of government with checks and balances. Now, when we look at the Virginia plan, we see that there were 2 bodies implemented in our legislature, and we did have 3 branches of government with checks and balances, although we did not have representation based on population in each of these bodies. So there were 2 parts of the 3 written by James Madison that were later implemented through the Great Compromise, which we will talk about in detail in just another slide. Now, the New Jersey Plan, we see the New Jersey Plan was written by William Patterson, and you do not need to remember that because I'm not evil. We also see that in this plan, they advocated for a single governing body within Congress. We did not have the House of Representatives and the Senate. We have Congress. So this body should be, according to William Patterson, based on equal distribution. Every single state within the United States should get the same amount of representatives in this body. He also proposed a Supreme Court and other aspects that were later implemented within our final plan. Now let's talk about this final plan, the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise was the merging of these two proposals, aspects from each, into what we now know as the system of government, the system of our legislature, which we have today. So, the Great Compromise. Some great, not so great compromises occurred at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The Great Compromise, which we introduced in the last slide, established bicameralism. This is how power is distributed within the legislative branch. We will go into more detail later on, but simply put, bicameralism is when you divide the legislative branch, the body which is tasked to write legislation and laws resulting in the governance of the greater population. That body will be divided into two. Bicameralism. We divide the legislature into two distinct bodies with different governing powers. We also see, within bicameralism, we saw that the House was a body designated by, where representation was designated by populations, while the Senate is a body within the legislature in which power is distributed equally. So parts of the New Jersey Plan and parts of the Virginia Plan did win out represented within each of these bodies. We also see that when we talk about population, there was a conflict at the time. How do we determine the population of every state when the states in the north have only free men and the states in the south have slaves as well? Well, do the southern states have the power to include the slaves in their population? Well, the northern states were advocating, saying they should not be able to, because those individuals, the enslaved individuals, would simply vote in line with their owners. And that was problematic. It was disproportionate power to those who owned slaves in the South, disproportionate power to these southern states. Well, the only way to compromise and make sure we had the unification of states at the time with the political environment that existed then was a three-fifths compromise, which I refer personally as a not so great compromise, but in no way is that what this compromise is titled. This is titled the Three-Fifths Compromise and known through history as this. If you put the not so great compromise on a quiz or test, I will be horribly saddened and will start to gradually stop saying this slogan because, well, it seems to be confusing you, but I thought it was simpler and helped you understand it. But let's talk about the Three-Fifths Compromise. This is where, remember, we had representation in the House determined by population. Well, how do we determine that population? Well, the southern states demanded that some form of their slave population should contribute to the greater population of the state. They are humans to begin with. So they concluded that 3/5 of every freed person, of the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, so indentured servants, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So we are counting this population as 3/5 a person. 3/5 of that population will go to the general population in which we determine the number of House representatives that each state will obtain. So without the Three-Fifths Compromise, we likely would not have been able to see the Great Compromise, in which established our current legislative body, a bicameral system of government, a bicameral legislature. We also see the Bill of Rights can be referred to as one of these compromises, as the Bill of Rights was a restriction implemented to applied to the federal government. The Anti-Federalists were fearful that this new system under the Constitution was granting too much power to the central body, and instead they thought they needed a founding document that restricts this central body and provides protections at the time for the states and the states' rights individually. Now we'll go on later to talk about selective incorporation in much later weeks that addresses how the Bill of Rights, which restricted only the federal government, will later apply to restrict state governments as well to implement protections for individuals instead of just states. But that is a discussion we will have later on. And we will talk about this in one of the later slides today. So bicameralism. Let me give you a concrete definition of bicameralism. This will be expected on a quiz, so please take notes on this slide. Bicameralism is the division of power within the legislative branch into two distinct bodies, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Our current House of Representatives has 435 members. Our Senate has 100. The Senate distributes 2 senators to every single state. The House of Representatives distributes the number of representatives based on the population. So Montana has far less representation than Virginia because we have less of a lower population than Virginia. So the Great Compromise established bicameralism within the United States. And the Great Compromise created the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now remember, this was a compromise between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. The number of representatives in the House is determined by population. This is proportional representation. If you have 1 million people in your state, you're going to get 1 representative in the House. If you have 5 million, you'll get 5. That's not the actual math, but to help you understand. Now, when we look at the Senate, we see that each state gets 2 representatives no matter their size. They have equal representation among within this body. This is bicameralism. Important key term to remember in this course. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk about this via email and dive into more detail. I know I fly through this at times, but bicameralism. 2 bodies in the body of government that is tasked with writing our laws and legislation and determining the budget. Far more, but this is what we will go into detail on in week 6. Today, just remember, we had Articles of the Confederation. Shays' Rebellion revealed it was weak. We had to have a constitutional convention. We debated the merits of this new system of government. We had a compromise, the Great Compromise, in which implemented bicameralism. Bicameralism is the division of power within the legislative branch into 2 distinct bodies. Now let's keep going. If the rhythm was off a little bit and this doesn't flow with the last slide, that's because I just had the entire lecture deleted, so I have to restart from this, well, half of the lecture deleted, so I have to restart from this slide. So let's, sorry if the flow is disrupted. If it creates any questions, just email me and I will address them immediately. So the U.S. Constitution. It's important to remember that each state had their own independent state-level constitutions prior to the implementation of the national constitution. So the idea of a guiding constitutional document was not a new idea at the time. We also saw that this constitution was not ratified in a single day. It wasn't ratified at the end of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Instead, it was ratified on a state-by-state basis between the years of 1787, when Delaware was the first, to 1790, when Rhode Island was the last to ratify the Constitution. This did replace the Articles of Confederation, which you remember was far too weak, and that was evident through Shays' Rebellion, in which we could not draft legislation adequately in an appropriate amount of time or mobilize troops to tame the rebellion. We also see that the Bill of Rights was not initially connected to the Constitution, was ratified a year later in 1791. So at the Constitutional Convention, we had the Great Compromise, the required compromise to having our final guiding document of the U.S. Constitution. In the Great Compromise, we established bicameralism. Remember, this is division of the legislative body into 2 entities. The House of Representatives, in which we have distribution based on population. Remember, James Madison, that Virginia plan. And then the Senate, equal distribution among states. And that was that good old New Jersey plan. And this balance created a system of the legislature in which we had the approval from the northern and the southern states. We also remember the establishment of 3 branches of government from the Virginia plan and the Supreme Court from the New Jersey plan. So the compromise between those 2 entities enabled us to have the U.S. Constitution that took us out of the Articles and implemented a stronger central government. Now let's talk about the Bill of Rights real quick. Remember, James Madison wrote the Bill of Rights, but in his original proposal, it was not the 10 amendments that we know today. Instead, it was a 17-amendment original proposal. He had 7 additional amendments that were either rejected or merged with others to provide the final 10-amendment Bill of Rights. Now, we also remember that Our first few amendments were not the ones we know of today. Our first amendment proposed by James Madison was to regulate the number of citizens per representative, as he believed we needed to have roughly 30,000 citizens per every representative, a number which has ballooned in modern days alongside our skyrocketing total population. We also know that our Second Amendment was not originally our right to bear arms, but originally was that Congress shall not increase pay to representatives until after an election in which they have the opportunity to be voted out of office. This is actually our current 27th Amendment. We'll cover that amendment in one of the later weeks in this course when we talk about change within the United States, because the story of that amendment helps you identify the avenues in which we can implement constitutional change as an individual. Now we could go into these other amendments in detail, but we see that the vast majority of them were either merged with others or outright rejected. So we know that we originally had a 17th Amendment Bill of Rights proposed by James Madison. Now that 17th Amendment Bill of Rights eventually became known as the 10th Amendment Bill of Rights that we have today. And we don't have to remember every single amendment word for word, but you have to be able to interpret these amendments and apply them throughout this entire course. So every one of these amendments will be brought up again. It is important that you feel comfortable and confident exploring them in detail. Now here I gave you a one-sentence oversimplified summary of every amendment. These are more expansive than I lead off right now, but it is important to get a foundation started at the beginning of this course. So our First Amendment, we know that quite well. Our right to freedom of speech, right to assembly, right to religion. And we also see our Second Amendment, our right to bear arms in a well-regulated militia. Third Amendment, one we do not use or talk about frequently nowadays, the Housing and Quartering of Soldiers Amendment, in which you cannot be forced to house and feed soldiers in the United States. We also see the Fourth Amendment, protects us from unreasonable search and seizure. This is our autonomy as individuals. This protects us throughout our daily lives, and contemporary uses are quite fascinating, especially within our judicial system. So we see our Fifth Amendment is protection of no double jeopardy, and protects one from being a witness against themselves. If you watch the Chappelle Show back in the day, you'll know that the skit where he's pleading the fifth because he will not incriminate himself within court when they're asking him questions. You have heard people plead the fifth, and this is a way in which you cannot incriminate against yourself. In addition, no double jeopardy means you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. We also see through the Sixth Amendment speedy and public trials. So we will not imprison you for many years without hearing your case. You have a right to a fast and fair trial that is accessible by the public. We also see the Seventh Amendment is a right to a jury of peers. Not only will you will not have an elite class determining your rights, but a jury of individuals like you, other citizens of your nation. We also see the Eighth Amendment, no excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishment. This is a fascinating one because this helps us see the difference in interpretation of our Constitution. Do you view this as saying you can't have cruel and unusual punishment? So it can be cruel, it can be unusual, but it cannot be both. Or do you see this as you can't have cruel or unusual punishment? A fascinating amendment that enables us to interpret our Constitution in different ways. We also see the Ninth Amendment. No amendment shall override grants granted by the Constitution. And in conclusion, the 10th Amendment right here, all power that is not delegated to the federal government is left to the states and the people. So this is an amendment that directly addresses our new system of government, the federal system of government, and that it is not an excessive concentration of power within the central entity, but an equal distribution of power between the two entities, the central federal government and the states, DC and Montana. So when we talk about the new Constitution, the strengthening of our federal government, we did talk about briefly that there was debate. There was two sides of this discussion. There were not just a collective of individuals excited to implement this new Constitution. There were many fearful of this new system of government. And that is where we see the first divide in American history between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. This is not the first established political party system, although their divide is significant. We'll explore that next week when we talk about parties for the first time in American government. So when we talk about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, we see that this divide stems from the question of how strong should our central government be. We see that the Federalists wanted a strengthened central government because we were not able to respond to threats like the Shays Rebellion, and we were not able to draft legislation and mobilize troops, while the Anti-Federalists thought that this was not the solution to this problem. We could not become what we just revolted against in Great Britain, an overly powered central government, and the Anti-Federalists did not want the ratification of the Constitution. Now, we see at this time period, there were opinion pieces written in the newspapers either for or against the ratification of this Constitution. This is where we see the solidification of these two divides. The Federalist Papers were written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, advocating for the ratification of this Constitution. Remember, it took 3 years to ratify this Constitution in all of the states. It was not overnight. And these papers were what led to the eventual ratification. Now, the Anti-Federalists was the pushback to this ratification. They were advocating for a sense of a libertarian perspective that this strengthening government would take away the rights of the individuals, while the Anti-Federalists, like James Madison, used these texts to advocate for their system of government by addressing the concerns of the counter perspective. So we see there was a divide that was created among the general problem of how strong should our central government be. Now, when we talk about the individuals that made up these collectives, I just wanted to give you a brief overview. There are some notable names on both sides, and they have some general identity traits. You see the Federalists wanted a strong central government. That was their overarching character trait, but they were predominantly urban. They were concentrated in the northern states. They supported the drafting of the Constitution, wanted a strong national military. Not only a strong national military, but a national military. At the time, we did not have one, and the Anti-Federalists did not want any national military, and instead wanted this to be addressed on the state level at all times. We had some notable Federalists, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, of course, the three authors of the Federalist Papers. And then we also see, on the other side of the divide, the Anti-Federalists. We know they wanted a weak central government with strong state powers, strong state rights. They were predominantly rural. They were concentrated in the southern states, especially in Virginia, home state. They were also weary of the Constitution's emphasis of a strong central government. They did not want a national military, as they thought that was another avenue in which we were excessively strengthening our central government, and they advocated for the ratification of the Bill of Rights, a document that restricts our central government and provides protections for the states. This document eventually, through a process called selective incorporation, applies to states and restricts states and federal governments to protect individuals, but that was not its original principles. So we also see among this side of the divide, we see Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and many others. Now, the Federalist Papers. Let's talk about the text in which they advocated for the U.S. Constitution, the ratification of this new document. Now, the Federalist Papers, there were over 80 of them, written by these three individuals, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, with Alexander Hamilton, as we know because of the play, writing the majority. Now, when they wrote these texts, they were well organized. Every single one of the Federalist Papers was written under the same pseudonym. This pseudonym was Publius. And in this defended the coexistence of federalism and republicanism within the United States. Some notable quotes from these texts, although there are many, consist of, quote, "Nothing is more certain than the need for government," end quote. And, quote, "The people must give to the government some of their natural rights in order to provide it with power," end quote. We see concepts of early liberalism stemming from John Locke in these Federalist Papers. We see a form of early American political theory advocated for in these papers. And I strongly suggest, well, as we have this week, there are two readings that you must go through, the Federalist Paper number 1 and Federalist Paper number 51. Fascinating texts. We'll dive into their details in the next slide or two. So, Federalist Paper number 1. This one was written by Alexander Hamilton, in which he argues for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And they, simply put, they identify the right and wrong side of the great question of should we strengthen the state through the ratification of the Constitution. He addresses the most significant challenges to this Constitution, although many texts will dive into more detail later on. A quote from this says, yes, quote, "Yes, my countrymen, I own to you that after having given the attentive consideration, I am clearly of the opinion it is in your best interest to adopt it." He also says, quote, "To decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force." End quote. He says, quote, among the most formidable of the obstacles which the new Constitution will have to encounter may readily be distinguished the obvious interest of a certain class of men in every state to resist all changes which may hazard a diminution of power. Addressing the challenges that face the ratification of this new system. But the fact is that we already hear it whispered in the private circles of those who oppose the new Constitution, that the 13 states are of too great extent for any general system, and that we must of necessity resort to separate confederacies of distinct portions of the whole. We've heard this argument in contemporary politics. This system is too large to implement this theory. But through these writings, through the next hundreds of years of history, we see that this system was indeed not too large, as we currently have a 50-state federal system of government in the United States. And Federalist Paper number 51. This was a text written by James Madison. This is the third time I've recorded this slide, so if this doesn't align with the last slide or the next slide, I'm sorry. Let's just make sure we get this foundational information down. So, written by James Madison, addresses the need for a system with checks and balances. This is really fascinating because it helps convey the difference in authors within the Federalists. We see Alexander Hamilton very passionately writing his text, while James Madison comes in more as a political scientist advocating for the benefits of this new system by addressing the fears and concerns of the counter perspective. So we address the need for a system with checks and balances. That's the overarching purpose of this paper. This text says we need checks and balances. This new system can provide security in the new form of government, and it helps oppressed minorities have avenues for representation. So, in this text, he says, quote, the only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior provisions are found to be inadequate, the defect must be supplied, so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of each other in their proper places. Quote, it would require that all the appointments for the supreme executive, legislative, and judiciary magistrates should be drawn from the same fountain of authority, the people, through channels having no communication whatever with one another. In that quote, we see authority stemming from the people, representative democracy, a republic. We also see, through channels having no communication whatever with one another, a system in which we do not have one entity governing, but division, in which we have entities governing, checking each other, and governing autonomously. And quote, in the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments, hence a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different government will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. Federalist Paper 51 addressed checks and balances. I accidentally skipped through to the next slide, but I just want to give you a little overview of that. Now, the Anti-Federalist Papers. We see Brutus, the pseudonym, coming in every now and then. There was a lot less organization within the Anti-Federalists. They were not always writing under the same unified pseudonym, and identifying who wrote them was not as simple of a task as previously. So we see that they feared a unitary government. That was the uniting bond between all of the authors that wrote under the pseudonym Brutus and others that identified with the Anti-Federalist collective. We see in this text some defining quotes. Quote, the limitation of government is the surest record of the happiness of the people. End quote. And another quote, and after so recent a triumph over the British king, after blood has been spent, it is truly astonishing that a set of men among us, Americans, would champion a government that would destroy our liberties. End quote. It was a simple problem in their eyes. We cannot become what we just revolted against. The strengthening of government is the last thing that people desire. Echoes of libertarian perspectives throughout this collective. Now, what do we have? We have a pluralist system of government. What did we talk about today? We talked about the Constitutional Convention, a moment where we identified a problem. Our government does not have the capacity under the Articles to address the issues that are coming up in our daily lives. We cannot tame a revolt within our own territory. How can we even address the threats of foreign entities? Well, through compromise, negotiation, debate, passionate at times, especially when Alexander Hamilton was talking. We'll talk about that later on. We see that we implemented a pluralist system of government, a system reliant and characterized by compromise and accommodation. We implemented a system in which you can disagree. We can have multiple groups vying for power within a single system of government. But the coexistence of those groups, in which we have majority rule, while also providing minority protections, provides a system in which we can have all of our interests advocated for. A pluralist system believes that power should not be concentrated in the hands of a single elite or group of elites. Instead, power should be granted by the people through the coexistence of numerous perspectives in a single system. Put simply, pluralism is a theory that views politics as a conflict amongst groups, in which multiple groups are vying for power in a single system of government. So what did we learn? Remember, this is how we do every single lecture. We're going to have a what did we learn slide at the end, where I ask you very direct and concrete questions, and I need you to be able to confidently answer them. And I hope that we can use this lecture and use these slides to see that there are ways to answer this, not just by telling me the objective fact, by passionately ranting. What are two of the primary compromises made at the Constitutional Convention of 1787? Well, we had two interesting ones. Remember bicameralism? We implemented bicameralism through the Great Compromise. We decided that the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan both had merit. We're going to have a House of Representatives based on population. 435 individuals can make up that body. Today, that's not what it was originally. But we also have the Senate. Equal distribution. Every state gets 2 representatives. We had that agreement because we had another agreement that was not so great, I would say. I wouldn't title it as the Great Compromise, but personally, when I think of the not so great compromise, when I personally think about it, that's the definition that comes to my mind. This compromise I'm talking about is labeled the 3/5 compromise, in which we determine the amount of the population, the number of the population, number of the enslaved population of the South to be counted towards the general population counts, which determine the proportionment of representation. So we see this 3/5 compromise enabling us to have a House of Representatives where proportionment is based off of population. It addressed the interests of the South with their large states with high populations when counting for slaves, and the interests of the North, smaller states, but with high populations when not counting the slave populations. So we also see, what did Shays' Rebellion reveal about the Articles of Confederation? Well, something just fell in my apartment, but I'm going to keep talking. So what did Shays' Rebellion reveal about the Articles? It was far too weak. We couldn't draft legislation when people were dying. We couldn't immobilize troops when there was a need for it. We could not do this when the threat was domestic. What about when the threat comes from a foreign entity? We needed to strengthen our central government, find ways in which we can respond to our populations. And what is bicameralism? We just talked about that division of power within the legislative body into 2 collectives. Remember pluralism? That beautiful way of understanding that we're a government, a society of multiple collectives. We are what we are today because we had opposition. We are what we are today because we listened to our opposition. We compromised and made accommodations for the minorities when the majorities were in government. We have a pluralist system of government in which we have multiple groups vying for power within a single system. How many amendments were in the original Bill of Rights? Here's more compromise. 17 amendments were originally drafted and proposed by James Madison, some of which were completely abolished and some of which later adapted, and many merged. We see that this was an example of compromise and accommodation among our representatives. Now, what is the primary divide between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists? It's the size and role of our central government. The Federalists wanted a strong central government that could respond to threats, while the Anti-Federalists thought a strong central government would become the threat. So we saw the difference in approaches when it comes to strengthening our government. Now, who wrote the Federalist Papers? Those 3 buddies. One even had a play about him. John Jay, we remember he just wrote a few, but he's worth noting because he was, for one, our first Supreme Court justice, and additionally, he wrote some very, very beneficial works within the Federalist Papers. Now we also see James Madison writing contributing to a large portion of the Federalist Papers as well. Now, what does Federalist Paper 1 and 51 address? 1 proposes this great question. What should our central government look like? And what side of this great question are you on? Because we, the Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, among many others, are on the right side of this great question. Now, number 51 addresses that we need, in this new system that we're proposing, a system of checks and balances. We understand your concerns, speaking to the Anti-Federalists, but we will address them through this system, in which we take authority from the same pool of people and we make sure that it is not associated. We have collectives that act as checks on each other. Now, here is a much better articulated way to answer all of those questions. And this is, of course, one of the most important resources when it comes to studying for the quizzes, which you will have next week. And that quiz will cover everything from last week, this week, and the next. It will also give you an opportunity to see how I ask questions and where the information stems from in these lectures. Remember, your lowest quiz grade gets dropped, so use this as a way to just feel out the course and see how I expect you to remember this information. Now, what's due this week? Remember, we have an essay topic selection assignment due by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday. This is the easiest assignment you will have to complete all semester, so don't let it stress you out. All you have to do is tell me what you're going to write your paper on when it comes to the midterm and your final essay. I have a document on Eagle Online in which I provide multiple options for you to write your paper on. Now, you have the ability to write an essay on a different topic. If you do that, you have more requirements on this assignment. If you choose a topic that's in the document, just tell me which one in a single sentence. But if you want to write a paper on something you are more passionate about and more interested in, you have to first tell me what this topic will be. Give me a detailed breakdown of what you're addressing. Second, why does this matter in the great scheme of political science? What are you adding to the discussion in writing this paper? And 3, how are you going to go about writing this paper? What are you going to pull from? Do you have a source that inspired you to write this paper? Just tell me why and how you're going to do this. So that is everything that's due. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I recorded this whole lecture 3 times today, and I hope that this is the one that sticks. There will probably be some glitchiness when it comes to the transitioning between slides in the video, but just know that this will not be a common occurrence, and I will fix this in the future, and we will not have this issue when it comes to next week's lecture. This is just laptop being tricky. I restarted it, and I think we're looking good. Apologies for any lack of flow. So thank you guys. Reach out. I want to talk to you guys. I want to meet you. Remember, I'm in my office every Monday and Friday, LRC 140. You can come by anytime. I'm happy to talk, and I'd love to get put a face to the name. I also am available over the phone. Call me, text me, email me. That's the preferred avenue. But I'm always here to talk to you. If you reach out to me on a weekday from 8 to 5, I'll respond right away. If you reach out on the weekend, I'll get to you soon. But reach out if any questions. This is college, my friends. This is the time where you have the responsibility to advocate for what you need. I can give you anything and everything, but I can't give it until you communicate what you need. So tell me what you need. It will be provided after you tell me. Thank you guys. Here's to a great week. And again, reach out with any questions.